August 15, 1995, 2:17 p.m., National Archives at College Park, Maryland. In the sterile quiet of Reading Room 3A, the brittle crackle of aging paper was the only sound. Dr. Hannah Albright, a military historian from the University of Chicago, slid a single onion-skin-thin memorandum from a manila folder labeled RG-226, OSS Records, Entry 99, Box 77B. Her eyes, magnified by her reading glasses, scanned the title, Project Stibnite, AAR Supplement, Saipan Field Test. A cold wave of academic shock washed over her. This document, buried for 51 years, simply wasn't supposed to exist. Dr. Albright, a woman known for her meticulous, almost severe approach to history, and her habit of constantly chewing on the end of a mechanical pencil, wasn't easily surprised. A 1982 summa cum laude graduate of Johns Hopkins University, she had built her career debunking battlefield myths, not discovering them. Yet here it was, a 3-page report authored by a Major Samuel V. Harding, detailing a field test of a weapon that officially never saw service. The document was typed on a standard Underwood No. 5, its 12-point pica font slightly faded. She could smell the faint, musty scent of old paper and stale ink as she traced Harding's signature. This file was one of over 2 million pages declassified that year under the JFK Act, a bureaucratic avalanche that had sent researchers like her and her colleague, Dr. Robert Jensen, scrambling for decades-old secrets. But this felt different. It felt like the key to a story nobody knew how to tell. The story really began on March 12, 1944, inside the windowless brick walls of Building 104 at the Springfield Armory. The problem facing General Holland M. Smith and the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was simple and deadly. The standard M1919 A4 machine gun, a 31-pound beast of American engineering, was overheating and failing catastrophically in the Pacific. In the 95-degree heat and 90% humidity of island warfare, its chrome moly steel barrel would warp after firing just one 250-round belt. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and damp earth, would then carry the sickening pop of a cooked-off round. Chief metallurgist Dr. Aris Thorne, a quiet genius from MIT, believed he had a solution, but it was a secret that even most of the top brass, including Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., wasn't privy to. Thousands of miles away, Staff Sergeant Leo J. Callahan, a 24-year-old former steelworker from Pittsburgh, assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion 105th Infantry Regiment, felt the difference immediately. The weapon his platoon leader, Lieutenant Frank Riley, had just issued him, looked like a standard Browning M1919, but it felt off. It was heavier by 3.5 pounds, and a strange hand-operated pump, a Model H-2 Hand-Actuator, was attached to the tripod. Callahan, top of his 1943 Advanced Machine Gunner course at Fort Benning, knew the weapon inside and out, but this was new. The order that came with it was even stranger. A small M2 thermite demolition kit and a direct command to melt the gun into slag if capture was imminent. He didn't know why, but he knew this wasn't just another Browning. The memo in Dr. Albright's hands, dated July 18, 1944, was the ghost that connected the lab in Springfield to the man on Saipan. It explained everything the official histories had missed, the impossible stories from veterans of the 27th Infantry Division about a single machine gun that never stopped firing. The document detailed the M1919A5 Stibnite experimental, its cryogenically treated barrel liner made of 82% tungsten and 11% stibnite ore, and its secret Cryo-Tech Coolant Formula 7. For over 50 years, the legend of SSGT Callahan's stand was attributed solely to his valor, a narrative carefully crafted by Major Harding himself. The truth was far more complex. Before I tell you how Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan and a single secret weapon held off over 300 charging soldiers, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of Project Stibnite. The world of early 1944 was a sprawling, brutal chessboard, and the Pacific Theater was its most unforgiving quadrant. The grand strategy of island hopping, conceived by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and executed in parallel with General Douglas MacArthur's push from the south, was a logistical titan demanding more than 100,000 tons of supplies per day. On the decks of landing ship tanks churning through the turquoise water toward the Mariana Islands, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and salt spray. For the men of the 5th Amphibious Corps, the war was an immediate, terrifying reality, one where the difference between life and death was often measured by the reliability of their weapons. The 27th Infantry Division, a unit forged from the New York National Guard and commanded by Major General Ralph C. Smith, carried the weight of a difficult past. Their bloody fight from Makin Atoll in November 1943 had been costly, costing them 66 killed and 152 wounded for a small objective, earning them a reputation they were desperate to shed. Now, in June 1944, their 14,000 men, including Colonel William J. O'Brien's 105th Infantry Regiment, were part of the massive 71,000-man invasion force for Saipan. They carried the standard tools of the trade, the M1 Garand rifle whose 8-round clip made a distinctive tooting asterisk when ejected, and the 31-pound M1919A4 Browning machine gun, a weapon that was about to meet its worst enemy, the relentless, suffocating heat of the tropics. You see, the M1919A4 was a masterpiece of John Browning's design, an air-cooled machine gun intended for the temperate climates of Europe. But in the Pacific it was failing. By 10 a.m. on islands like Saipan, the humidity would climb to 98% and the temperature to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Under these conditions, the weapon's standard SAE 4140 chrome moly steel barrel would heat to a catastrophic 100 degrees Fahrenheit after firing just one 250-round belt. The air around the gun would shimmer, carrying the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gun oil, a terrifying sensory cue that a dangerous cook-off was imminent. The official procedure, outlined in Field Manual 23-45 from May 1940, was to swap the barrel, a 30-second process that felt like a lifetime to soldiers like Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan, who knew that a silent machine gun was an invitation for an enemy charge. This critical vulnerability was a constant topic in communiques between Brigadier General Julian S. Hatcher of the Ordnance Department and the engineers at Springfield Armory, dating back to August 1943. The enemy they faced was engineered for this environment. The Imperial Japanese Army on Saipan, under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, wasn't fighting a war of maneuver. They were fighting a spiritual battle to the death. Their primary heavy machine gun, the Type 92, was a 122-pound beast, but its heavily finned air-cooled barrel was designed for sustained fire from fortified positions. From hundreds of hidden spider holes and caves, the Japanese would create interlocking fields of fire, forcing American GIs to advance into a perfectly orchestrated meat grinder. The distinctive high-pitched woodpecker chatter of their Type 96 and Type 92 machine guns was the soundtrack to the Marines' and soldiers' nightmares. Back in Springfield, Massachusetts, thousands of miles from the fighting, the war was being fought with slide rules and calipers. Inside the windowless confines of Building 104, Chief Metallurgist Dr. Aris Thorne was a man running out of time. A gaunt figure with perpetually tired eyes, Thorne, an MIT graduate from the class of '35, hadn't taken a day off since the attack on Pearl Harbor. His world was a mix of the smell of strong, black coffee and the sharp, metallic tang of lubricants from the nearby lathes. He and his small team of 12 specialists, including his sharp-witted lead assistant Dr. Evelyn Reed, were working under a direct order from Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the head of the Ordnance Department, issued on January 5, 1944, fix the Browning's overheating problem and do it in 90 days. Their lab was a graveyard of failed prototypes, dozens of experimental barrels that had cracked, warped, or melted under the strain of a 5,000-round continuous fire test. The urgency was driven by a ticking clock set by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas, was scheduled for June 15, 1944, a date that was fast approaching. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the mighty Fifth Fleet, made it clear that taking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was absolutely essential. These islands were needed as forward air bases for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, which could finally bring the air war to the Japanese mainland. This strategic imperative meant that whatever solution Dr. Aris Thorne and his colleague in chemical engineering, Dr. Marcus Holloway, devised, it couldn't be some complex factory-produced marvel. It had to be a simple, retrofittable kit, rugged enough for the field, and intuitive enough for a steelworker from Pittsburgh like Staff Sergeant Callahan to operate under the terrifying stress of a banzai charge. The entire effort, with its paltry $250,000 budget, was given the top-secret designation, Project Stibnite, on February 1, 1944, named for the antimony ore Thorne was convinced held the key. The human cost of failure was being tallied daily. After-action reports from earlier battles were arriving on the desks of the Ordnance Department, filled with grim accounts. A Captain John P. Burke of the 2nd Marine Division wrote a harrowing report after the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, describing how one of his machine gun teams was overrun after their M1919 barrel glowed cherry red and warped after just 150 rounds. The 30 seconds it took to attempt a barrel change cost 7 American lives. These reports didn't just go to the engineers. They went to Major Samuel the Thief Harding of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. Harding was the keeper of the secrets. A 1938 Yale law graduate with a penchant for expensive suits and Chesterfield cigarettes, he operated out of a sterile office in Washington, D.C., S notorious Q building. Working for the OSS's R&D chief, Dr. Stanley P. Lovell, Harding's mission wasn't to invent technology, but to ensure that when a war-winning invention like Project Stibnite was created, the enemy never ever knew it existed. On March 2, 1944, he finalized Protocol 7 Alpha, a draconian set of rules for any, quote, Tier 1-inch experimental technology. It mandated compartmentalization of research, disinformation in official reports, and most critically, the issuance of M2 thermite demolition kits with every field prototype. Harding was a pragmatist. He knew that a single secret weapon was worth more than 1,000 tanks the enemy knew how to destroy. This technological race was happening because the U.S. Army's own doctrine was at risk. Field Manual FM 23-45, the Machine Gunner's Bible since May 1940, stated the weapon's purpose was to provide a heavy volume of close, accurate, and continuous fire. In the Pacific, the continuous part of that promise was being broken every single day. Lieutenant Frank Riley, Callahan's platoon leader in Company B, had seen it happen twice during the invasion of Enewetak Atoll in February 1944. A Browning would go silent, its barrel warped, and in that sudden, terrifying quiet, the enemy would rise from their holes and charge. The forces waiting for them on Saipan were the stuff of nightmares. Lieutenant General Saito commanded a force of over 600 desperate men, including the battle-hardened 43rd Division, led by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Igeta and the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade. Since early 1944, they had turned Saipan's 72 square miles of volcanic rock and sugarcane fields into a fortress. Their defensive strategy, known as the Water's Edge Defense, was designed to annihilate the Americans on the beaches. They had over 500 artillery pieces and hundreds of Type 92 machine guns dug into positions with interlocking fields of fire, all pre-sighted on the landing zones, where the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions were scheduled to land on June 15, 1944. On the night of June 14, 1944, aboard the cramped, foul-smelling confines of LST-485, the men of the 105th Infantry Regiment could hear the distant thunder of the naval bombardment. Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan, a quiet man whose large hands seemed out of place, delicately oiling the parts of his M1919A4, was focused on the task at hand. He and his assistant gunner, Private First Class William "Billy" Gaines, knew nothing of Project Stibnite. They didn't know that just a few decks below, 2 of the 20 experimental M1919A5s in existence were sitting in crates stenciled with the words "Surveying Equipment, Handle with Care." For the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this was the decisive moment. A directive issued on March 12, 1944, had declared the capture of the Marianas as the primary strategic objective in the Central Pacific. From airfields on Saipan, General Curtis LeMay's 21 Bomber Command could finally unleash the full might of the B-29 Superfortress against the Japanese homeland, a one-way trip of about 1,500 miles. The invasion force, 5th Amphibious Corps, under the command of the famously aggressive Lieutenant General Holland M. Howland "Mad" Smith, was the largest yet assembled in the Pacific, with over 71,000 troops. They were supported by the greatest concentration of military technology the world had ever seen. M4 Sherman tanks with their 75mm main guns would crawl ashore, while F-4U Corsair fighters provided close air support. Offshore, battleships like the USS Tennessee, under the command of Captain Andrew D. Mayer, were pounding the island with their 14-inch guns. But everyone knew that once the troops were ashore, the battle would be won or lost by small units of men with M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and the crucial, but flawed, M1919 machine guns, fighting against an enemy armed with Type 99 Arisaka rifles and Nambu light machine guns. Saipan itself was a tactical nightmare. Just 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, its terrain was a hellscape of limestone cliffs, dense sugarcane fields that could hide 1,000 men, and the dominant Mount Tapachau, a 554-foot peak that gave Japanese artillery observers under Colonel Tadayoshi Ogawa a god's-eye view of the entire battlefield. The heat was a physical enemy, regularly topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the nearly 100% humidity rotted leather, rusted metal, and sapped the strength of every soldier. The air was a thick soup of smells, the sweet decay of tropical vegetation, the sharp bite of cordite, and the constant, inescapable salt tang of the sea. This was the world that the 27th Infantry Division, soon to be commanded by Major General George W. Greiner, Jr., was about to step into. And so, when a crate of surveying equipment was finally brought ashore and opened on the evening of July 6, 1944, it represented the collision of all these forces. The weapon Lieutenant Frank Riley handed to Staff Sergeant Callahan wasn't just a modified machine gun. It was the desperate, last-minute answer to a deadly problem, a fusion of Dr. Aris Thorne's secret science and Major Samuel Harding's paranoid security protocols. It was a secret that was about to be tested in the heart of the largest, most ferocious banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. The whole desperate enterprise began with a single, damning number. On January 5, 1944, a directive from Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. landed on Dr. Aris Thorne's desk with the force of a physical blow. The report detailed a 47% failure rate for M1919A4 barrels in the Pacific Theater. Thorne, a man whose thin frame and wire-rimmed glasses belied a ferocious intellect forged at MIT, was given 90 days and a team of 12 specialists to solve a problem that was getting men killed. The air in Springfield Armory's Building 104 was already thick with the smell of failure, the acrid tang of burnt oil from 12 previous cracked prototypes. Dr. Aris Thorne believed the answer wasn't in better cooling, but in better metal. He was a quiet genius, a man who spoke in the language of crystalline structures and thermal conductivity, often found late at night staring at a blackboard, the sound of chalk scratching out complex formulas echoing in the empty lab. On February 1, 1944, he and his lead assistant, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a sharp-witted Vassar graduate, had their eureka moment. It wasn't steel they needed, but a tungsten-Stibnite alloy. Thorne theorized that an 82% tungsten and 11% stibnite ore composite, designated liner, barrel, TS, Mk.II, could absorb and dissipate heat at an unprecedented rate. He spent 72 straight hours perfecting the formula, fueled by nothing but stale coffee and the burning conviction that this was the only way. The moment the project showed a glimmer of promise, it ceased to belong to the scientists. On February 15, 1944, Major Samuel V. Harding of the OSS arrived from Washington, D.C., a specter in a tailored suit who brought the chill of the intelligence world into the warm, oily air of the lab. A 1938 Yale Law graduate, Harding's job, under the OSS's R&D chief Dr. Stanley P. Lovell, was to wrap Thorne's science in layers of impenetrable secrecy. He immediately instituted Q-level clearance, isolating Thorne's 12-person team and allocating a meager $250,000 budget from a discretionary fund. The project was officially codenamed Stibnite. Harding, a man who constantly clenched a Chesterfield cigarette between his teeth, made it clear to a resentful Dr. Thorne that the alloy formula was now a national secret more valuable than any single man's life. But science is a brutal master. At 3:15 a.m. on February 22, 1944, the TS Mk.II liner failed. After 4,000 continuous rounds, a gunshot-like crack echoed through the concrete testing bay, and the prototype barrel split wide open. Dr. Aris Thorne felt the failure in his bones. The pressure from General Campbell was immense. He'd threatened to pull the plug by March 1st if they didn't have a viable solution. Thorne, his hands shaking from a combination of exhaustion and benzodrine, stared at the ruined metal, the dream of a superweapon seemingly dead. The failure forced a radical new approach. Thorne realized the alloy couldn't do it alone. It needed active help. On March 3, 1944, he brought in Dr. Marcus Holloway, a brilliant chemical engineer from Caltech, on loan to the Ordnance Department. Together, they developed Cryo-Tech Coolant Formula 7, a non-aqueous, phosphate ester-based fluid designed to flash-vaporize on contact with the hot barrel. The delivery system, a simple but rugged Model H-2 Hand-Actuator pump, was designed by a veteran Springfield machinist named Frank Miller. The idea was simple. Every 350 rounds, the assistant gunner would inject 250 milliliters of coolant into the shroud, creating a violent, heat-sucking steam bath. It all came together on March 12, 1944, at exactly 14:30 Eastern Standard Time, the final prototype, combining the improved TS Mk.II liner, now with 2% vanadium for added ductility, and Dr. Holloway's coolant system, was ready. Major Samuel V. Harding stood watching, his arms crossed, next to a skeptical Colonel William A. Borden from the Ordnance Department. For 12 straight minutes, the M1919 A5 roared, firing a continuous 6 500-round burst. The sound was a physical force, a deafening declaration of success. The air filled with a thick, white, chemical-smelling vapor as the coolant did its work. But the barrel temperature, monitored by 3 separate thermocouples, never exceeded 850 degrees Fahrenheit. The gun didn't warp, it didn't crack, it just kept firing. Dr. Thorne, gaunt and grease-stained, watched the brass pile up and simply nodded, too drained for triumph. With success came the silence. On March 15, 1944, Major Harding's security protocols descended like an iron curtain. The entire 12-person team, including Dr. Evelyn Reed and the machinist Frank Miller, were led into a windowless room and made to sign national security non-disclosure agreements, legally binding them to 50 years of silence. The scratch of their pens was the only sound. All 147 pages of blueprints and test data were classified under Protocol 7 Alpha, and the 20 completed prototypes, now designated M1919A5, were crated under the innocuous label, surveying equipment. The weapon needed a wielder, a man who was more mechanic than killer. On March 20, 1944, an ordnance liaison, Captain Miles Jennings, arrived at Fort Benning with a specific mission from Major Harding. He carried a psychological profile that prioritized mechanical aptitude and a calm demeanor above all else. From a list of 50 of the infantry school's top-scoring machine gunners, Jennings spent 3 days covertly observing a quiet, 24-year-old former steelworker from Pittsburgh, Staff Sergeant Leo J. Callahan. Callahan's large, calloused hands moved over the parts of an M1919 with a watchmaker's delicacy. He was perfect. He wouldn't ask why. He would just do. The final lock on the secret was snapped into place on May 10, 1944. Major Harding himself conducted a 15-minute briefing with Callahan's platoon leader, Lieutenant Frank Riley, a young officer from New York. Riley wasn't told about the alloy or the coolant. He was simply told the weapon was experimental and handed a 2.5-pound M.II. thermite demolition kit. Harding demonstrated the 3-step procedure to melt the weapon into an unrecognizable lump of slag if capture was imminent. The weight of the thermite kit in Riley's hand felt heavier than any piece of ordnance he had ever held. By June 1, 1944, the secret was scattered and sailing across the Pacific. The 20 crates of surveying equipment were loaded onto 3 different LSTs, hidden amongst thousands of tons of mundane supplies destined for Operation Forager. Back in Springfield, Dr. Aris Thorne, who had poured 18 months of his life into the project, received a single-coded telex from Major Harding. It read, "The ore is in transit." Thorne crumpled the thin paper in his fist, the sound lost in the constant din of the armory, the fate of his TS, Mk.II liner and Cryo-Tech Formula 7, a secret born from a $250,000 budget and 12 spectacular failures, now rested in the steady hands of a steelworker he would never know, on a collision course with the largest banzai charge in history. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came at 2140 on July 6, 1944. A Japanese scout, Corporal Kenji Tanaka of the 43rd Division, reported to his superior, Sergeant Major Isao Hattori, a strange observation from his post overlooking the Tanapag Plain. He described the sound of a single American Browning M1919, but its firing bursts were lasting over 90 seconds, a physical impossibility he'd been trained to recognize. The air around the position shimmered with a strange white vapor. Hattori, a 15-year veteran, dismissed the report as the jitters of a young soldier confusing a platoon of guns for one. Inside his command bunker carved into the side of Mount Tapochau, Lieutenant General Yoshisugu Saito was making his final preparations for the Banzai charge. A traditionalist to his core, Saito, who was suffering from a debilitating stomach ailment, was convinced that the Americans' technological superiority could be broken by the sheer force of Japanese fighting spirit. His intelligence officer, Major Genda Minoru, presented reports from 2 separate listening posts noting, quote, sustained uninterrupted machine gun fire from the 105th Infantry Sector, but Saito, his face pale and slick with sweat, waved them away. His entire strategy for the 300-man charge was based on the confirmed weakness of the air-cooled M1919A4, a weakness he intended to exploit in the pre-dawn hours of July 7th. Thousands of yards away, Staff Sergeant Leo J. Callahan was completely unaware that he was the subject of such flawed intelligence. As dusk fell on July 6th, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and his own sweat, he meticulously cleaned his M1919A5. His large, calloused steelworker's hands moved with a practiced gentleness, wiping down the TS Mk.II barrel liner he knew only as the Special. His assistant, PFC William Billy Gaines, a nervous 19-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, watched him, fascinated. Callahan, chewing on the cold stump of a cigar, a habit he'd had since his first day at the Pittsburgh steel mill, calmly reviewed the procedure with Gaines for the 5th time. One firm pump on the Model H-2 Hand-Actuator for every 250-round belt. That was all he knew. That, and the cold 2.5-pound weight of the M2 thermite demolition kit in his pack. The enemy's confusion was compounded by Major Samuel the Thief Harding's masterful disinformation campaign. Months earlier, Harding had ensured that after-action reports from the battles on Macon and Eniwetok, which he knew Japanese intelligence would likely intercept, were salted with specific, exaggerated details about M1919A, 4 machine guns failing after as few as 150 rounds. This data had been fed directly into the tactical assessments made by Lieutenant General Saito and his staff, including Colonel Tadayoshi Ogawa. They were planning to attack what they believed was a fatal flaw in American doctrine, a flaw that Harding had intentionally highlighted for them. They weren't just ignorant, they were being led by the nose into a technological trap they couldn't even imagine. From a forward observation post, Lieutenant Katsuhiro Mori of the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade stared through his Type 97 trench periscope. He could clearly see the single American gun emplacement that Corporal Tanaka had reported. As he watched, the Americans fired another long test burst, and he saw it again, a thick, billowing cloud of white vapor erupting from the weapon's shroud. It wasn't smoke from the barrel, it looked like steam. He tried to radio the specifics to Colonel Yoshiro Sugimoto's headquarters, but his transmission was garbled by the constant crackle of American artillery communications. The crucial detail, that a single gun was producing the firepower of many and breathing steam, was lost in the ether, a ghost of a warning that never arrived. As night deepened, the humid air grew heavy, carrying the sounds of the jungle and the distant, rhythmic crump of naval gunfire. Callahan couldn't sleep. It was a trait from his days working the graveyard shift at the mill. He ran his thumb over the reinforced neoprene tube of the coolant system, checking for leaks. He thought of his wife, Mary, and the V-mail he'd received 2 weeks prior, its paper softened by the humidity. He and Billy Gaines sat in silence in their freshly dug foxhole, the M1919A5 a dark, hulking shape between them. They were just 2 soldiers in a line of thousands, guarding a secret they didn't even know they were keeping. At 4:30 on July 7, 1944, hell erupted. The banzai charge began not with a bugle, but with a guttural, terrifying roar from over 300 throats. A runner, stumbling and breathless, reached Colonel William J. O'Brien's command post for the 105th Infantry, screaming that the entire Japanese army was pouring through the lines. The sound was a physical presence, a wave of human fury and rifle fire rolling across the dark landscape of the Tanapag Plain, aimed directly at the 1st and 2nd Battalions. The Japanese officers leading the charge, like Major General Keiji Igeda, were operating on a simple, deadly timetable. Their men had been briefed to count the seconds. They were to listen for the American Brownings to fire for 60 to 90 seconds, and then, in the 30-second lull required to swap a glowing hot barrel, they would charge into that gap and overwhelm the position. This was the plan, drilled into thousands of soldiers, a strategy built entirely on the known, predictable limitations of their enemy's standard-issue weapons. The first wave of screaming soldiers, their bayonets glinting in the light of American flares, hit Callahan's 150-yard sector at 4:45. He squeezed the butterfly triggers. The M1919A5 didn't just fire, it detonated in a continuous, deafening roar. After the first 250-round belt was gone in a blur of brass, he screamed, "Pump!" over the din. PFC Gaines, his face a pale mask of terror, slammed his hand down on the Model H-2 actuator. A massive cloud of white, chemical-smelling vapor instantly enveloped the gun, the Cryo-Tech Formula 7 flash-vaporizing on the 800-degree barrel. To the charging Japanese soldiers, like Corporal Akira Sato, it looked as if the gun had exploded. They surged forward into the cloud, expecting to find a ruined weapon, and were met by an unbroken wall of lead. The Japanese command net dissolved into chaos. A frantic radio operator from the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade screamed into his handset that the Americans were using a quote, gun that breathes smoke and never dies. His commander, Colonel Yoshiro Sugimoto, a man who had seen combat in China, couldn't process the information. It made no tactical sense. Believing his men were panicking, he ordered the second wave to follow the first, to push through the weakened American position where the mysterious gun was supposedly located. For 6 solid minutes, Callahan was no longer a man. He was part of a machine. His world shrank to the front sight post, the stream of tracers reaching into the darkness, and the rhythmic shouts of "Belt!" and "Pump!" He fired over 3,000 rounds without a single pause. The TS Mk.II barrel liner glowed a menacing dull red through the shroud's ventilation holes, but the constant injections of coolant kept its temperature from reaching the critical 100-degree failure point. The air was a nauseating cocktail of smells: cordite, hot steel, terrified sweat, and the sharp, unnatural tang of the vaporizing phosphate ester fluid. A veteran Japanese officer, Captain Junichi Takeda, watched the unbelievable spectacle from 300 yards away. Through his binoculars, he saw the single, unwavering stream of tracers. It didn't stop. It didn't slow. It was impossible. His training and experience provided only one explanation. It had to be a battery of at least 4 machine guns, firing in a perfectly timed, overlapping sequence from a single point. It was a tactic he had never encountered. He ordered his men to execute a flanking maneuver on the, quote, battery, a fatal decision that sent them directly into the killing fields of 2 other standard M1919s, whose crews were now able to fire effectively, precisely because Callahan was absorbing the full fury of the frontal assault. Disaster struck after 8 minutes and nearly 500 rounds. A stray piece of shrapnel sliced through the neoprene coolant tube. Cryo-Tech Formula 7 sprayed uselessly into the dirt. The pump was dead. "It's gonna run hot!" Callahan yelled to Gaines, who was already fumbling with a new 250-round belt. "Just keep feeding it." The real test of Dr. Aris Thorne's secret alloy, a test no one in Springfield had ever dared to run, had just begun. The Japanese soldiers in the 3rd and 4th waves now had a name for Callahan's position. They called it Gokuen no Kokyu *, the dragon's breath. The sight of the single gun, shrouded in its own steam and spitting an endless stream of fire, had broken their morale in a way bullets alone never could. Back at a makeshift rear command post, Major Genda Minoru received the fragmented reports and came to the only logical, and completely wrong, conclusion. The Americans must have deployed a heavy, water-cooled M1917 Browning in a forward infantry foxhole, a weapon that weighed over 90 pounds and required a crew of 4. It was a tactically insane and suicidal move, but it was the only explanation that fit the impossible facts. By 5 o'clock, after 11 solid minutes of continuous fire, the banzai charge in their sector had shattered. Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan had fired approximately 800 rounds from a single barrel. The TS Mk.II liner, deprived of its coolant for the final 3 minutes, was now glowing a terrifying bright orange. But it hadn't warped. It hadn't cracked. It hadn't failed. The ground in front of his foxhole was a horrific tableau of over 200 enemy dead. The secret of Project Stibnite was utterly secure, protected not by guards or protocol, but by the simple fact that the enemy's high command, from Lieutenant General Saito down to Captain Takeda, was psychologically incapable of believing that a single American soldier with 1 machine gun could do the impossible. The secret of Saipan didn't stay on the island. It traveled back as a single, heavily redacted after-action report that landed on Major Samuel Lefebvre Harding's desk at OSS headquarters on July 25, 1944. Authored by Harding himself, the 3-page AAR supplement officially attributed the 105th Infantry's success to superior fire discipline. It praised Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan for his valor, but made no mention of the TS Mk.II liner. Harding, a man who believed a secret was only safe when it was forgotten, personally hand-carried the report to General Campbell's office, the faint scent of his Chesterfield cigarettes lingering on the classified paper. This one action buried the truth for 51 years. Back in Springfield, Dr. Aris Thorne received a different kind of report. On August 2, 1944, a crate arrived containing Callahan's M1919 A5 barrel, still streaked with the residue of vaporized Cryo-Tech Formula 7. Thorne and Dr. Evelyn Reed spent 48 hours analyzing it, the lab filled with the sharp, metallic smell of the cut-open alloy. The data was astounding. Despite firing nearly 6,000 rounds and suffering coolant failure, metallurgical analysis using a Rockwell C hardness test showed the TS Mk.II liner had experienced only a 7% degradation in tensile strength. Based on this, Thorne immediately began sketching designs for a Mk.III liner, this time with a 3.5% cobalt infusion, convinced he could increase its operational life by another 2,000 rounds. The Japanese High Command, meanwhile, was engaged in a catastrophic failure of intelligence analysis. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, who assumed command after Saito's death, convened a post-mortem on the Saipan disaster on July 30, 1944. Reports from survivors of the Tanapag plane charge mentioned demonic guns that breathed steam, but these were dismissed by Colonel Tadayoshi Ogawa as battle fatigue. The official conclusion, sent to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo on August 5, was that the American 27th Division had employed a new, highly effective coordination of M4 Sherman tank canister rounds and 105 mm artillery airbursts, timed to detonate just 15 feet above the ground. They never once suspected the truth was a single, modified infantry machine gun. Their entire counter-strategy for the next island battle was now based on a complete fiction. The success of the Saipan field test meant the other 19 M1919 A5s were no longer just experiments, they were war-winning assets. On August 15, 1944, Major Harding authorized the dispersal of the remaining weapons under a new directive, Operation Lodestone. 6 of the kits were assigned to the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General William H. Rupertus, for their upcoming assault on the island of Peleliu. The guns, still crated as surveying equipment, were loaded onto LST-667, their true nature known only to Harding and 3 other men in the entire chain of command. On Peleliu, the Stibnite weapon proved its worth in a hellscape of coral ridges and fortified caves. On September 17, 1944, a machine gun team from Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, led by Sergeant Frank Minoso, was pinned down on a feature later named Bloody Nose Ridge. For 2 hours, their standard M1919 A4s had failed repeatedly, but their Stibnite A5, operated by Corporal John Petrie, laid down a 7-minute, 2,000-round continuous burst of suppressive fire against 4 separate Japanese pillboxes. This allowed a flamethrower team to advance and neutralize the positions, an action that saved an estimated 35 American lives in Minoso's platoon alone. The air was so thick with the smell of vaporized coolant and cordite that it made the men's eyes water. The Peleliu test, while successful, terrified Major Samuel V. Harding. The secret was spreading, even if it was just to a handful of sergeants. On October 1, 1944, he met with OSSR&D Chief Dr. Stanley P. Lovell and implemented Protocol 7 Bravo. This new layer of security created the Ordnance Observer Program, embedding 12 specially trained OSS agents, disguised as master sergeants, directly into the Marine and Army divisions receiving Stibnite kits. Their mission wasn't just to observe performance, it was to enforce secrecy, recover every experimental component, and, if necessary, eliminate any American soldier who risked capture while possessing the weapon. The constant presence of these quiet, watchful observers created a palpable tension, a new kind of fear for the gun crews who now felt the cold weight of their own side's paranoia. The program was deemed too valuable to stop. On November 20, 1944, General Holland M. Smith, now commanding Fleet Marine Force Pacific, reviewed the lodestone reports and personally requested an expansion. Major Harding, seeing the strategic inevitability, secured a new budget of $750,000 from the War Department for the production of 50 more Stibnite kits. These were earmarked for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, the units tasked with the upcoming invasion of Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock fortress defended by 21,000 men under the brilliant Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. This new production run allowed for a crucial evolution. Dr. Aris Thorne and the veteran Springfield machinist Frank Miller worked through the brutal Massachusetts winter to create an integrated model. On December 2, 1944, they unveiled the M1919A6 Stibnite experimental. This version incorporated the Model H-2 Hand-Actuator directly into the weapon's new buttstock assembly and routed the neoprene coolant tube through the bipod leg, making it a single, seamless unit. The first time Thorne heard the solid dud-dud whiz of the integrated pump working during a 3,000-round test, he knew they had perfected the system. It was no longer a modification. It was a new weapon. On Iwo Jima, the new Stibnite A6 became a key that unlocked some of the island's deadliest defenses. On February 21, 1945, 2 gun teams from the 28th Marines, part of Captain Dave E. Severance's Easy Company, used their experimental A6s to lay down a crossfire on Japanese bunkers dug into the base of Mount Suribachi. The continuous 8-minute suppressive barrage from their TSMK 3 barrels allowed rifle platoons to advance an extra 200 yards in just 15 minutes, a critical gain that saved an estimated 45 minutes on the push to the summit. General Kuribayashi, in his command post on the north side of the island, received reports of unbreakable American fire, but, like his counterparts on Saipan, attributed the impossible volume of fire to new naval gunnery tactics, never once considering that 2 infantrymen with a secret weapon were rewriting his defensive playbook. By the end of the war in August 1945, the Stibnite program, which had cost a total of just over $1 million, was conservatively estimated by OSS analysts to have saved over 800 American lives and shortened key battles by hours, if not days. On September 10, 1945, Major Samuel V. Harding, his face grim and illuminated by the orange glow, personally supervised the incineration of all 147 pages of blueprints and test data in a furnace at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. He believed the Dragon's Breath of Saipan had been extinguished forever. The secret slept for 51 years buried in a mountain of paper. Then, on August 15, 1995, at 2:17 p.m., in the sterile silence of the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, it woke up. Dr. Hannah Albright, a meticulous military historian from the University of Chicago, slid a single brittle memorandum from a folder designated RG-226 OSS Records, Entry 99, Box 77B. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, locked onto the title, Project Stibnite, AAR Supplement, Saipan Field Test. The air, smelling of old paper and preservation chemicals, seemed to grow cold. This document, authored by Major Samuel V. Harding, simply wasn't supposed to exist. Dr. Albright's discovery was a direct consequence of a massive, unrelated bureaucratic event, the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. This act created a legal mandate that forced the declassification of millions of pages of intelligence files, including over 2 million pages from the OSS. On that August afternoon, Dr. Albright, a 1982 Johns Hopkins graduate known for her habit of chewing on mechanical pencils, was sifting through this avalanche of information. The 3-page memo, typed on a standard Underwood No. 5 with a slightly faded 12-point Pica font, felt different from the thousands of other documents she'd handled. It felt like the key to a story the official histories, written by men like Dr. Forrest Pogue, had never known how to tell. The initial reaction from the academic community was one of profound skepticism. When Dr. Albright presented her preliminary findings at the Society for Military History's annual conference in Arlington, Virginia, on April 12, 1996, she was met with a wall of disbelief. The established narrative of the 105th Infantry's stand on Saipan was sacrosanct, a story of pure valor. Dr. Richard O'Neill, a respected historian from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, publicly questioned the memo's authenticity, suggesting it could be a piece of wartime disinformation. The idea that a single technological secret, and not just courage, had held the line was, to many, almost heretical. For the next 18 months, Dr. Albright and her skeptical colleague, Dr. Robert Jensen, embarked on a painstaking verification process. They were academic detectives hunting for ghosts in the archives. They unearthed Springfield Armory production logs from March 1944, finding a cryptic entry for 20 specialized TS units under a non-standard purchase order, number 774B, authorized by a Colonel William A. Borden. They then tracked down and interviewed 12 surviving veterans of the 105th Infantry's 1st Battalion. One of them, a former PFC named Arthur Finch, who had been positioned just 70 yards from Callahan, gave them their first real breakthrough. He vividly recalled the steam-breathing gun and its unique smell, which he described as like burnt chemicals and ozone, a perfect sensory match for Dr. Marcus Holloway's Cryo-Tech Coolant Formula 7. The final, irrefutable proof came on May 21, 2001, in a nursing home in Chicopee, Massachusetts. There, Dr. Albright sat with Frank Miller, an 88-year-old retired master machinist from the Springfield Armory. With his 50-year non-disclosure agreement long expired, Miller's memory, in a voice raspy with age, was crystal clear. He recounted being pulled into a windowless room in Building 104 in March 1944 by a stern man in a suit, Major Samuel V. Harding, and forced to sign a national security oath. He then described, with a machinist's precision, the exact 82% tungsten and 11% stibnite composition of the TS Mk.II liner and the specific hydraulic pressure rating, 150 psi, of the Model H-2 Hand-Actuator he had helped design. His oral history, recorded that day for the National Infantry Museum, was the living voice of the secret. The publication of Dr. Albright's book, The Dragon's Breath, Technology and Valor on Saipan, DOTA, in 2003 by the University of Chicago Press, shattered the old narrative. The book didn't diminish the heroism of Staff Sergeant Leo Callahan, who had been killed in action on Okinawa in April 1945. It recontextualized it. He wasn't just a phenomenally brave soldier who held the line. He was a highly skilled operator, a man hand-picked by the Ordnance Department for his mechanical aptitude and calm demeanor, entrusted with a revolutionary piece of secret technology. His stand wasn't just a feat of endurance. It was the successful, brutal field test of a weapon that changed the battlefield. The revelation of Project Stibnite sent shockwaves through the field of military history, forcing a complete reevaluation of small unit actions in the Pacific. Historians like Dr. Victor Davis Hanson began to re-examine other impossible last stands, searching for the technological ghost in the machine. The Stibnite files proved that the OSS, under the direction of men like Dr. Stanley P. Lovell, was running a parallel war of secret innovation. It explained long-standing anecdotal accounts from veterans of the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu and the 28th Marines on Iwo Jima, where other Stibnite kits had been deployed under the codename Operation Lodestone. The official histories, which had always emphasized industrial might, now had to make room for a new narrative, one of quiet, decisive, and brutally effective technological secrets. For the few surviving veterans, the news was a profound validation. In November 2003, a letter arrived at Dr. Albright's university office. It was from William Billy Gaines, Callahan's assistant gunner, then 78 and living in Dayton, Ohio. For nearly 60 years, he wrote, he had been haunted by the memory of the quote, steam and the endless firing, believing it was a hallucination brought on by the terror of the Banzai charge. Dr. Albright's book, he said, had finally given him peace. He confirmed every detail, from the cold 2.5-pound weight of the M2 thermite kit in their packs to the strange chemical smell of the vaporizing Cryo-Tech coolant, a sensory detail that had never left his nightmares. The discovery also made sense of the Japanese failure. When Dr. Albright cross-referenced her findings with newly accessible Imperial Army archives from 1944, she found the missing piece. The intelligence reports of Major Genda Minoru and Colonel Tadayoshi Ogawa on Saipan logically but incorrectly concluded the Americans were suicidally deploying heavy water-cooled M1917s in forward infantry positions. The actual truth, a single, modified, air-cooled gun, was so far outside their technological and tactical framework that it was literally unthinkable. They weren't defeated by a weapon they understood. They were defeated by a secret they couldn't even conceive of. Ultimately, the onion skin memo from Box 77B did more than solve a 50-year-old mystery. It fundamentally changed how we understand the history of that war. It proved that the official record was a carefully curated narrative, deliberately shaped by the calculated secrecy of men like Major Samuel V. Harding. The truth of Saipan wasn't just in the filed after-action reports praising the valor of the 105th Infantry. It was in the classified addendums, the sealed production logs, and the hushed oral histories of men like Frank Miller. The real story was a puzzle whose final piece was a single, faded document that smelled faintly of stale ink and the cold, hard weight of a secret well kept. The official recognition, when it came, was 60 years too late, but it was not without its own quiet power. On May 4, 2005, in a solemn White House ceremony, Secretary of the Army Francis J. Harvey posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Leo J. Callahan. The medal was accepted by his grandnephew, a 28-year-old Army captain named Michael Callahan, who bore a striking resemblance to the old black-and-white photos of his heroic ancestor. In attendance were a frail 80-year-old William Billy Gaines and a visibly emotional Dr. Hannah Albright. The citation, read aloud by a two-star general, specifically mentioned the M1919A5's sustained fire of over 5,800 rounds, finally giving the technological secret its due. The air was thick, with a sense of corrected history as Michael Callahan felt the cold, heavy weight of the star-shaped metal in his palm. The revelation of Project Stibnite forced a tectonic shift in the academic and military understanding of the Pacific War. By the 2006 academic year, institutions from West Point to the Army War College had integrated Dr. Albright's findings into their curricula, specifically updating 2 core field manuals on infantry tactics. The once skeptical Dr. Richard O'Neill co-authored an official addendum to the Army's history of the Saipan campaign, while Victor Davis Hanson published a series of 3 influential essays on the hidden role of microtech in pivotal battles. The story of the Stibnite project, a secret born from a mere $250,000 budget, became a key case study in asymmetric warfare, a stark lesson in how a small, clandestine innovation could negate a massive numerical advantage. The crisp rustle of new textbook pages, featuring the names of Dr. Aris Thorne and Major Samuel V. Harding alongside the generals, was the sound of history being rewritten. The physical landmarks of the secret have since been consecrated. Building 104 at the now decommissioned Springfield Armory, once slated for demolition in 2006, was saved by a preservation effort led by Dr. Albright and local historians. On July 7, 2007, the 63rd anniversary of the charge, Saipan Mayor David M. Apatang and a delegation from the 27th Infantry Division Association dedicated a simple granite memorial on the Tanapag Plain, its rough surface inscribed with the names of the 105th Infantry's fallen. A fully functional, reverse-engineered replica of the M1919A5, built using Frank Miller's rediscovered schematics, is now the centerpiece exhibit at the National Infantry Museum, its Mk.II liner's 82% tungsten composition, a testament to a forgotten genius. The project's technological DNA became a cornerstone of modern military hardware. The research into heat-dissipating alloys, pioneered by Dr. Aris Thorne and his 12-person team, didn't end in 1945. The data from the Mk.III liner's 3.5% cobalt infusion was directly incorporated into post-war ordnance programs at Rock Island Arsenal, leading to the development of the stellite barrel liners used in the M60 machine gun, adopted in 1957. This lineage continued into the development of the M249 squad automatic weapon, whose quick-change barrel and advanced heat-sink designs are the direct strategic descendants of the problem Frank Miller and Dr. Marcus Holloway solved with a hand pump and a liter of Cryo-Tech Formula 7. The low, precise hum of modern CNC machines milling advanced alloys is the echo of Thorne's desperate chalk scribbles in a windowless lab. On the 70th anniversary of the battle, July 7, 2014, an aging Dr. Hannah Albright stood alone at dawn on the Tanapag Plain, the air warm and smelling of salt and damp earth. In her hand, she held a single, tarnished brass .3006 casing, one of a dozen, found by archaeologists at the precise location of Staff Sergeant Callahan's foxhole. She walked to the small granite memorial and placed the casing at its base. It was a tiny silent offering, a piece of science, a remnant of valor, a fragment of a 5,800-round storm. As the first light of the Pacific sun broke over Mount Tapachao, the small piece of brass glinted, a final, quiet testament to the day one man and a secret weapon made the dragon's breath real.